Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Cota podcast. Today with me, Jung.
Well done.
Well done. Yeah, I practiced like 5 times before saying this properly. Welcome to the show, John. I'm very
Thanks
happy
for having me.
Thank you for hosting me at your place, at your home in Marin County, north of San Francisco. It's a beautiful day outside, and we're going to talk about two things with John. John is a very experienced entrepreneur. He has a strong background in energy, especially in the last decade. He successfully grew and sold a company in the energy sector, Greensmith. So we're going to talk about his experience as a founder. Well, not exactly a founder, but an entrepreneur. And then in the second part of the podcast, we're going to talk about energy, in particular, energy storage. There's plenty to talk about, so let's get started. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I was born in Seoul, South Korea. I was largely educated in Canada. But I had a tough choice because my undergrad was in economics and pre-med. What I loved is what my mom was doing. She was a real entrepreneur. She's one of the first, people/women to bring bikinis to South Korea on the clothing manufacturing and design side, right? And then she went on to do a lot of design for couturier, bridal, and so on. But, I wanted to give that a go. But I didn't want to let go of the science aspect of trying to, predict the outcome through methods of business, which is probably one of the most complex sciences there are. So I went into strategy consulting. And that was terrific because I got a chance to not only be in relatively high pressure situations, opining about what could be fixed at a big company to, C-level and board, but also span across multiple industries. So you really got a bit of an 80-20 on what drove multiple industries like metals and mining, like telecom, like specialty chemicals, like consumer intensive goods, et cetera. So after that, it was about the time when all the so-called dot-coms were getting started. So I felt like I really needed to make that shift, and that was more in keeping with where I wanted to go. And then after about 4 startups, largely in the B2B space, where we're trying to automate different business processes, I was hired into Greensmith by the venture investors.
Yeah, let me interrupt you there for a second.
Sure.
I think it's interesting. People are quite familiar with the founder that comes up with an idea, decides to start a company and starts from ground zero, looks for funding, etc. But they're, I think, less familiar with the hired gun model, where essentially there is an existing company struggling somehow, and the investors usually, or the board members, or sometimes it's the same person, they say, we need someone here to help. So you were hired by an investor, I believe so, to come into this company. And how big was the company at that point, and what was the issue that they had, and why you were picked to solve it, to fix it?
I mean, let me comment on what you said about the phenomena itself, about
Yes.
non-founders becoming founders, as
Yes.
it were. I think when you take a look at basically a set of founders, who have done very well with an invention of some kind, something that's going to be fairly disruptive. I think in many cases you have the kind of accompaniment or team members that are also well versed in scaling an idea to a product or service,
Yes.
and scaling that product and service to a company, and ultimately hopefully growth and success and exit and all that kind of stuff. So I think underneath the headlines there's a lot of that stuff going on. But what was interesting about my introduction into Greensmith is that it was very, very early stage. So yes, indeed, as you described, a lot or some of the last 4 prior to Greensmith, companies that I was introduced to, they were some of them were stagnating. They had already kind of gone through different cycles of product development and company development. But some of them were actually flatlining insofar as growth. And you come in, you try to identify the issue. With Greensmith, it didn't even have a product by the time I joined. But having said that, it was the first time I was introduced to the electricity grid. And that's bad because you have a lot to learn. But it's good in the sense that sometimes you shouldn't solve the same problem the same way with the same people and expect a different outcome, right?
Yes.
The definition of insanity.
Yes.
And I was more than willing to ask all the dumb questions. And ultimately, although the company started with residential arbitrage to victory as a strategy, which to this day is isolated in certain markets that offer a subsidy only when it comes to either generation or storage, I just concluded, this was about 10 years ago, that maybe that's not the best strategy to invest a lot of capital in. So the good news is, after that initial analysis, the investors and the board, along with some of the co-founders, decided to kind of let me answer the question, well, what would you do, John?
Yeah.
Right? And so number one, I said, let's go after the biggest market. Why not, right?
Because residential was not as big.
Oh, it's the smallest market.
Exactly.
Today, it's one of the smallest market segments.
Yeah.
Behind the meter, so-called commercial industrial, is growing too, but both are much smaller than so-called utility scale. And not only are they smaller, but if you take a look at the per kilowatt cost of solar as a good example, you compare residential versus utility scale, the comparison in cost is 3 to 1.
Wow.
3 to 1, not 2 to 1.
In addition to being a bigger market.
In addition to being a bigger market. And that's why, and also if you want to have a big impact on the grid, you're going to do it 200 megawatts at a time, not 3 kilowatts at a time.
Yes.
So, we're blessed enough to have, solar roof tiles, and 2 power walls. But it takes a lot of those to kind of amount to
have an impact.
The kind of deficit of capacity that we're experiencing here in California, which I'll get into a little bit later. The second thing that we decided to change is my view, just because I came from a lot of B2B plays that were all about software, distributed computing, making better decisions with data, is that software was going to be at the core of our model. So no matter how big we built our systems, how many batteries we procured from the biggest battery OEMs around the world, that software was going to really lead the charge on ROI.
And this is the, let's say, 2008, 2009 timeframe. So it is not obvious to make that choice, because now, of course, everyone starting a company now or taking over a tiny company that just started would, of course, say software is going to be at the center of this. But 11, 12 years ago, it was not obvious at all.
No, it's not. And secondarily, for the electrical grid industry or energy itself, there's a lot of underlying what I would call closed system software operating in the background, but it's still not today an industry where you would have an SAP managing a asset-intensive industry, which in effect what the electrical grid is. And I'll talk much more about that.
And by the way, on your founder comment earlier, most people do not know that Elon Musk did not start Tesla.
He wasn't founder.
He arrived when Tesla was tiny and decided it was a good idea. He was
Yeah.
actually looking for to start a company in that space, but found these 2 founders and a few engineers, and decided it was what he wanted, and he just essentially took over, took a majority ownership. So and I think I actually agree with you.
And Steve Jobs also is not an engineer.
Yes, absolutely.
A lot of people
absolutely
don't know that.
Absolutely. Well, Jeff Bezos is not an engineer, even though he's now probably smarter or more educated than many engineers, just because of what he did at Amazon. But yeah, you're right, absolutely. And in fact, I think founder, to me, instead of being too strict about the definition, I mean, to me, for example, you are a founder at Greensmith, simply because you took the company when it was tiny. You actually rewired the company, changed the strategy.
It was so early we could do that.
Yeah, exactly. So in a sense, it's almost as if you started the company from scratch to me. And plus, you've been there for almost 10 years, and you brought the company to a wonderful exit in the sector. You were telling me earlier that the company sold for $170 million.
Yeah, much too little, by the way, but
there
was some investment fatigue. But yeah, we only raised 33.8, which is about a seventh of the average raise in startups that are very similar.
So you are very capital efficient, to put it in a different way.
Well, I don't believe in this adage that you hear sometimes, that you should raise as much money as possible, because for 2 reasons. One is you have to return that money if you're going to get some more later. You have to do well with it. You have to have outcomes. The second reason is that I think sometimes when you have enough or too much money, you're tempted to try different things, as opposed to really force yourself to make a decision on what is it that you want to be really good at. What do you want to disrupt? Typically very large incumbents like ABB, Siemens, and GE at, et cetera. So anyway, it turned out to be one of the best exits in the industry by every measure, and it includes deploying, I think, about a third of the total U.S. capacity of energy storage in 2016. And that was on a turnkey basis where we had to deliver everything.
And this is against giants like GE and others,
Yeah,
right?
all the guys.
So despite you were a relatively small company compared to these giants, you deployed a third of the storage.
With less than 40 people.
With less than 40
And that's one of my definitions of disruptive, is that if you have 4,000, 40,000 engineers, that's one thing. But if you have literally 40 people in your company, and or just over half are either software engineers or mechanical engineers or electrical engineers, etc., and you're able to beat the heavyweights because not only you have a good idea, but you executed like crazy on that idea and better than others.
Yeah.
And we deployed a 100 megawatt hour system in response to Aliso Canyon, which was a big gas leak in California. We did it in under 4 months. And so, I mean, power plants, which is what an energy system can be, right? Depending upon what you want it to be, oftentimes take 2 to 4 years to build. This was in response to emergency.
So 10 times faster.
10 times faster. It's very dispatchable. And again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'll get into the depths of energy storage in a moment.
Tell us a bit more about the business now, because I think the energy sector and what you did at Greensmith is a bit harder to understand for people, because we might be familiar with software models, with B2C, sometimes with B2B. So it's a bit easier to imagine your sales motion or how you addressed the market needs. But tell us a bit more about what you did. So you arrived at the company, you decided to not focus on residential and instead focus on large scale. What happened then? What did you do? Yeah. How did you go from a few folks and not a lot of funding to being able to raise, in any case, more than $30 million? What happened there?
Yeah, I guess the biggest driver behind that is that we continue to execute against a strategy that was really difficult. So what we didn't want to do is, attempt a strategy that one of the big incumbents could copy, with the skunk team.
Yes.
33.8 million is rounding error to some of these companies. I mean, they probably spend more on toilet paper than that. So,
absolutely.
So we wanted a tough strategy, and that tough strategy involved the conclusion that I came to after I visited over 100 battery factories around the world. That said, batteries are like car engines, in that you have a Ferrari engine and you have a Fiat engine. Or Volkswagen engine. Let me use Volkswagen.
Yes. Right? Well, Fiat, FCA, whatever. Yes.
But yes, they're very, very different. But they're really built for different purposes.
Yes.
And energy storage and batteries and the overall market has opened in that regard. In that energy storage perhaps is the first grid appliance that is programmable, that grid operators can use to solve a myriad of different problems, not just the duck curve, which we worry about here in California around the growth of intermittent resources and, when the sun goes down or the wind stops blowing. So what we had to do, therefore, is build a platform, both IT and both mechanical, that was battery agnostic. And that's super hard. And by the end, I think we deployed about 100 systems as part of Wärtsilä, who owned half the marine market. And they operated about 100.
The company that
acquired us, and a bolt-on acquisition, basically. After McKinsey wrote a report for them that said, this is the company you should acquire. Thank you very much, McKinsey. All these different places have different applications. And in addition to the software, where you can turn on, turn off different applications in the software, same stack of software, one instance of the software, you need to select the right hardware. Inverters, yes, but mostly batteries. So there are some batteries that are really meant for Apache helicopters that need to get out very, very quickly.
And be lightweight
and all that. And they don't care if it's super expensive because they're going to save a lot of people.
Yes.
Or the kind of batteries that are super long duration that we're talking about. And so, that combined with an absolute focus on customer value. Well, I mean, that kind of sounds funny to say. Like, of course you're focused on. But what that literally means in the case of energy storage is beginning to reverse engineer your model on how do my target customers make money. Because if you take a look at our customers, which are electric utilities, regulated most often, independent power producers, developers, I mean, those are the major customers. C&I customers, people who want to put renewables in their buildings because they can.
Yeah.
There's a certain way that they make money, but they're all very different. Electric utility typically is a rate-based, mechanism that is about 100 years old. That is a close thing to monopoly because, people felt economies of scale and the social benefits of having an investor-owned utility is a good thing. Those times are, of course, changing. But you compare that against a Google or an Amazon that has huge data centers that are soon going to consume as much as 20% or more of the total electricity in the world. I mean, you look at your Netflix, you look at all the photos that we
almost as
around.
bad as Bitcoin mining.
Yes, that's another interview that we should talk about, the Byzantine generals problem. But anyway, we really decided to build a platform that was really hard to build, which was battery agnostic. And 16 battery integrations later, we picked the batteries. We argue that we actually probably had to know batteries better than the OEMs because they had to be really good and efficient at building a single battery or maybe even multiple batteries. We had to be good. Like Apple does not manufacture most of its components. It just understands design. Yeah. It definitely understands what customers want and how to keep, the ecosystem alive with App Store, with iPad, with the Macs, and then the phones, right? But we decided to be what's called an integrator. And it was super hard, but we also executed on that vision to the front of meter crowd, and then we went back a meter. And the rest is kind of history. And I just noticed, after 18 months of so-called post-merger integration, I had Wärtsilä, which is a great company, by the way. I thought it was our third acquisition offer, and we decided to say yes instead of other ones that were more associated with power companies, where 90% of your pipeline would literally go away overnight because people don't want to compete against each other in the pipe, right? Is that, a lot of the men and women who joined the journey and made Greensmith successful, they stayed on and they found great careers within Wärtsilä. Some of them have moved on to bigger and better things, of course, right? But that's nice to think. Well, hopefully, knock on wood.
Nice. And can you give us maybe one example? You can be as technical as you want or specific as you want on a battery decision that you took for a customer. You can name the customer if you want, or if you don't want to, it's fine. An example where your approach was somehow counterintuitive or not expected, but it paid off because of the strategy you were pursuing.
Yeah, there's so many examples, but I'm going to give you one that's pretty recent and pretty relevant to what's happening out there. There's a huge transition, as we all know, to intermittent resources. Solar, wind, basically, is what I'm talking about. And yes, there are mandates. Yes, there are goals, but all of it, I'm very happy to announce, is being pushed by the invisible hand of economics, right? Levelized cost of energy, which is probably the best total cost of ownership methodology that we have in the energy space. And so it's good to see. So as part of that, because we were supporting a lot of developers, in this case, we were supporting a developer that's based in Europe. I won't mention names.
That's okay.
But they're many of them are at the forefront of not only being global organizations, but really going after what they see as an existential transition that they're making as a provider of electricity into so-called renewable sources. So there was a big RFP, of course, in Arizona with one of the two main utilities that are in Arizona that was associated with hybridizing energy storage with solar, which is also, I always believe energy storage would be one of these things that we never talk about because it's everywhere. But in being everywhere, it's being coupled and hybridized with a lot of other things, generation, distribution, all these other assets and technologies. And this was an RFP that said, okay, can you guys, who's going to be the best? And this was a global RFP. So this wasn't something that was in the US only. Everyone and their uncle bid in on it. Now, what was funny is that Greensmith is a provider of technology. So we're not the ones bidding directly into these things. Those are the developers. Our customers are. Yeah. And what's nice about it is that we can ride many horses. So I'm very happy to report, because of that model, that out of 7 finalists on that RFP, we were included in 4.
Okay.
So our chances of winning were higher than 50%. Yeah. And not only that, 2 of them we knew about because we worked with them. The other 2, they just threw us in because, they had, I guess, a decent amount of respect for our technology capabilities. Mm-hmm. And this is at a time when fires are still happening, where a mistake could cost you millions, if not billions of dollars,
Yeah.
and a great deal of reputation, etc. So anyway, getting back to your question about doing something related to picking the battery, we're the only vendor that submitted a bid that included a titanate oxide battery. It's called LTO, and it's basically where it's high C related applications that you use titanate oxide. It's a little bit expensive, but it's really good for certain applications. And because in this case in Arizona, you wanted to do the hybrid system in a way where energy storage would benefit from the ITC, which is a tax credit you get from solar, based on how much of the energy is actually being stored.
Okay.
We did the modeling, we did the math, we did all the sensitivity analysis, and discovered that it was an NMC, which is still the popular, sort of chemistry for lithium
Which
ion
stands
today.
for, yes.
Nickel, manganese, cobalt.
Cobalt.
Yeah, cobalt being, obviously the precious earth that 2/3 of which comes from
Congo.
From DRC.
Yep.
And a lot of people are kind of moving away, and it's introducing LFP and all these other cathodes and chemistries, which we'll talk about. But at that point, we were, I believe, the only technology company that recommended titanate oxide. And guess who won?
You won.
Because the math just showed not just our ability to deliver that much value and achieve the result, but the overall cost on the basis of both power and energy was the lowest, with perhaps at a street price level, one of the more expensive lithium ion batteries that are out there.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's counterintuitive if you just start with one thing and base everything on it. But if you take a look at the performance of the total system and what you're trying to achieve, what your customer is trying to achieve,
Yes.
you get to a different answer. So that was a little bit long-winded,
No,
but
it's a
I
great
needed
example.
to explain a little bit of detail behind it.
No, I like the example for maybe 3 reasons even. Reason number 1, it shows that the right strategy, in your case, you essentially went away from being concentrated on yourself as a company, and you decided, we want to see what's best for our customers, what makes them money, because if we do, these customers are going to be happy with us. In fact, 2 of the 4 bidders using your technology, you were not even aware of.
No.
Which,
I mean, we knew them. They knew our technology.
but you were not involved in them
No.
submitting a proposal
No.
that included your technology,
Yeah.
which is a testament to the fact that you were very good at making them successful at selling their products and services to someone else.
the team was very good.
Okay. And then reason number 2, most people think, batteries are just lithium ion. They just think that's the only technology and that's all there is. Instead, there are tens,
Oh my goodness.
or if not even hundreds, but let's say commercially, there's tens of different technologies for batteries. And the reason is, and you know this better than I do, but batteries can charge faster or slower. Batteries can stand more or less cycles of recharging.
Right.
Batteries can have a certain sensitivity to temperatures.
Yes.
Batteries can be more or less polluting depending on the components that made it.
Absolutely.
And sometimes there is a political trend related to a specific metal or a specific element. Like now, cobalt is pretty much the bad guy. And rightfully so. But sometimes, correct me if I'm wrong, let's say 10, 12 years ago, nobody cared about the fact that cobalt is mined in Central Africa in certain conditions. It is bad for the population involved in this mining, but it's also very bad for the environment. No one was talking about it, even though we knew already. It wasn't just discovered last year. So it's interesting that there's these many elements. And it shows that if you have the right approach, the right technology, the right model, you can actually pick the best technology, in this case for battery energy storage, that fits that particular use case. And then there is the third example, the third reason why I liked your example. You mentioned that there were tax credits associated with that particular deployment. And sometimes the factors involved, there is some factors involved in the success or failure of a particular initiative that do not depend necessarily just on technology or just on market forces, but there is some incentive, some external factor that influences that thing all over the place. In fact, in Europe, for example, I remember when Germany, 20 years ago or so, decided to provide incentives for solar. And in Italy, I was in Italy back then, people thought they are crazy. Germany is cloudy all the time. Why are they going to install solar at all?
Yeah.
But instead...
And the rest is history.
And the rest is history, because now not only Germany is the biggest solar producer, now being surpassed by Spain and Italy eventually, but they led the way and they incentivized the market. They actually provided the right incentive for German industries to build solar panels, and they became a leader in that space. So they were actually very smart, and we had no idea about it.
A little bit of bleeding edge. I think some of the highest electricity prices are in Germany, and there's a reason. And when I made the comment about solar and wind being at parity or better than a lot of fossil forms of generation, that does require fuel. Last time I checked, sun is approximately free.
Yes.
Wind is approximately free. That's without subsidies, right?
Yes.
And we could have a very long conversation about who gets subsidies.
We're not going to get there.
Oil and gas industry. But yeah, I mean, batteries are, I think, we're very sort of non-household conversation items, like even 10 years ago. Although lithium ion in particular is almost 30 years old. I mean, Sony is really the first company to really drive high density kind of battery.
Was
as a
it
way.
with the Walkman? Yes.
Yeah, Walkman and other consumer electronics. In fact, to this day, the biggest single market segment for batteries, and it tends to be lithium ion because of the density.
Yeah, because
and that's why cobalt.
Guys like this.
Yeah, and that's why cobalt, continued to be a thing, and it continues to be a thing. Although it's not 111 NMC, it's 811 or 611 or the various formulas, or people are coming out with different variants. And I'm going to get into cathode, anode, electrolyte, all that kind of stuff. Is the fact that lithium ion has been with us for a very long time, and it really ushered in portability, which is a big deal. It's a much bigger deal than I think people realize. Beyond our handsets and our laptops, etc. In spite of COVID and the need to be at a workstation somewhere afar, we like to be mobile as the way we work, the way we play, the way we do things.
So let's talk about energy storage, battery storage. There's a lot of misconception about it. Most people do not realize that it is not just about lithium-ion batteries. It is not just about mobile phones and electric vehicles. But there is a lot going on there. In fact, you told me earlier that there are almost like two buckets or two categories. One is the obvious one, and one is what you call the Jones category, right? So tell us a bit about that. So give us a view of the landscape of battery storage first, and then we're going to dive deeper into those two areas.
Sure. The two segments are the basic kind of 101 use cases and why we have batteries and why we have energy storage, and the second one is more related to what I believe is really needed on this grid to not only support the transition but to really modernize it like many other asset intensive industries we have. I think this is basically this Frankensteinian this electrical grid thing that we built for over a century, and unfortunately it's not something that you can kind of rebuild from scratch. You're flying the airplane while you're rebuilding the airplane.
Yeah.
So I'll start with some of the foundations and then get into the first two segments. So batteries and the advent in particular of lithium ion is about 30 years old, and Sony is really the first one to start it, and they propagated a lot of consumer electronics devices, including the Sony Walkman. I think you're old enough to know that. Just
I
like
remember
me.
that. Yes.
Yeah, so what was important in those battery chemistries and batteries is that they're not only safe, but they were very dense, because we wanted portability. We don't want, you remember the compact computers, back in the day, where you thought you were being, pretty amazing.
In fact, there's energy density is something that people do not know well, but gasoline has, I think, roughly 40 megajoules of energy
megajoules
per liter.
Yeah.
While today lithium-ion batteries are at about 2.5, 3 in the best cases.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of parity things that are happening, and I mean, just because you mentioned it, I think it's a good comparison. You could say directly, indirectly, we've been compared. We, as in batteries, kind of modern distributed energy storage technologies, compared batteries with a barrel of oil, and a barrel of oil is an incredibly powerful thing. All right.
Equates to
there's a
years
reason why,
of work by
well,
human
there's 20
being.
years of work approximately by a healthy human being, working 9 to 5 each week and so on and so forth. But anyway, getting back to the batteries is not necessarily a new thing. We've enjoyed it in consumer electronics, but as the densities got better, as it became more affordable, it began moving into electric vehicle space and then the stationary storage space. And also, I like to say batteries, as I might have mentioned earlier, are like car engines. They're, you have a Ferrari car engine and you have a Volkswagen car engine. And there's a reason. I mean, they're very different. But there's a very good reason why, if you're on an Apache helicopter, you want to start and get out really quickly versus the batteries that you need to address more long duration energy storage issues. Because here in California, we're worried about the duck curve, et cetera. So there's a lot. But I don't know if you heard about this, but people are surprised that the improvement, if you kind of look at density, cycle life, cost, how quickly you can charge and discharge, and all the things that we care about, the improvement per annum over the last 30 years has been between 2 to 3%. It hasn't been
Compound, though. Compound.
Yeah, it's a CAGR kind of number.
Yes.
But it hasn't been 30%.
Yes.
Because the lithium-ion industry decided to lower cost by 50% at the rack level, I think in about 2016, because they wanted to capture the stationary storage market, does not mean the scientific improvements, the mathematical improvements have been. So, I mean, but the good news is that, like the Henderson curve that has allowed solar to now become as cheap, if not cheaper, in levelized cost of energy, which is the best total cost of ownership
without subsidies.
Measurement without subsidies. Just like it will not stop. It'll continue, just like transistors and silicon chips and Moore's law and other things, right? So it's a great time, and that's part of the reason why these two sister industries, the electric vehicle industry and stationary storage industry, is really starting to take off. Because although the form factors are a little bit different, the underlying materials that go into batteries are similar, right? And the NMC formulation is a good example where cobalt is super important metal for that cathode because it offers a lot of density. Now, the sustainability issue there is that 2/3 of it comes from the DRC, from one country, where there are some questions about labor practices and other things. So people are not only innovating like 611,
yes.
1 being the ratio of cobalt, but a lot of the battery makers around the world are asking the question, well, can we use other metals? Yes. Or can we use non-precious earth so that we don't have to mine these things at all? And it's really opened up, because these markets have opened up and the costs have been going down, a lot of new markets that didn't really exist before, which is terrific. And I tend to look at energy innovations and investable companies, etc. It's marvelous to see all the people working away. I'll just give you 2 examples: solid state batteries that are way safer than most of the lithium-ion batteries today that are based on electrolytes that are like fluid, right? Like
yes.
Electrolytes like Gatorade, basically, right? That conduct electricity. And then others that are working on using even spent silicon as a way to improve the performance of the battery, although you have to worry about a lot of unintended consequences.
From photovoltaic.
Exactly, that are disposed from photovoltaic or even new silicon, right? So there's a lot of innovation that's happening right now. So with that backdrop, and energy storage being one of the fastest growing segments of any industry, partly because you're starting from a small number, I hasten to add, but it's going from megawatts, hundreds of megawatts, to gigawatts now. I mean, it's because you cannot really have that transition with a grid that's designed where you have to consume everything while it's being produced, to one that not only wants that inventory control so that you can, just like food supply and other commodities, but at a time when we're switching to intermittent resources and worried about duct problem, energy storage becomes super, super important, right? Now, the first segment that is basic is because of that problem, that the grid wasn't designed such that you could actually slow the inventory of electrons that travel approximately at light speed, right? As we know, right? And so a lot of grid operators around the world, whether they're regulators or people who operate utilities or even independent power producers, worry about the balance between supply and demand. And that imbalance is expressed by virtue of frequency, right? Which is cycles per second. It's 50 in some parts of the world, it's 60. In Japan, it's both 50 and 60. And there's reasons behind that. Once that gets misaligned, that's when you worry about brownouts and blackouts. And things like voltage, right? I'm not going to get into 101 of, electricity math. And if it wasn't for Tesla, who really propagated alternating current,
Nikola Tesla,
the real Tesla, we wouldn't have a modern grid. But the first basic one is it's creating that time machine capability of an incredibly distributed network of generation assets, which in some cases never talk to one another. They don't. I mean, think about like virtualization of computing power or storage, right? And think about one computer not knowing what the other. I mean, you would never think about that. Like, how could you do that? How could you optimize effectively, in math terms, a polynomial equation? Well, that's how our grid operates today. Yes, there's people over control boards worried about this vast region, etc. But many of the major regional operators of grid networks, there's about 4+, depending upon how you count it. Many of those grid networks do not actually integrate with one another. They don't share electrons. But what's more, they don't share information unless there's cascading blackouts or some kind of critical event. So the one basic thing that I would ask you to think about with energy storage is that we need that time machine on the grid. And because of the affordability, there's more and more going in, and it's going in, dare I say, at the residential level as well. Although that's a premium purchase. Just as a reminder,
and it's also a small part of the market.
Exactly, because per kilowatt, which is the unit of measure of solar, for instance, utility scale, the big stuff in the deserts, etc., versus household, the cost comparison is 3x. Meaning, what we pay at the residences, which is still a luxury good, is 3 times higher per kilowatt than the large, solar farms that you see out there that a lot of developers and IPPs
and it's mostly because of scale, but also because of installation costs.
Exactly.
There's many factors.
So if you have 100 megawatts, versus 5 kilowatts, 5 kilowatts, you just multiplied by the number of pre-sales, the number of sales, the number, the lead time, the money that it takes to keep things going during that lead time, the installations, the points of failure you have to monitor and respond to, the costs just go up. It's not just the panels themselves, but although, some of the residential players can buy in bulk, right? They can consolidate that procurement. So anyway, that's door number one. And what's more, the thing that I want to remind everyone on the first segment is that time shifting, arbitrage, many ROI cases in the world, if it relied only on that, would not make any sense. And as startup people, we care about that because we want, obviously our companies and our products and services to be ROI positive. Otherwise, you don't get funded, etc. Energy storage, I think EPRI did many, many studies, along with San Diego National Labs. They're one of the foremost in looking at the commercialization. Can do somewhere between 30 to 40 different things. Not all of them are ROI positive. They're becoming as we hit $100 per kilowatt hour and lower. But and the first market, I would argue, is PJM frequency regulation that paid operators who bid in these assets, right, to respond to a 2-second signal that they would provide 24/7 to help them manage frequency regulation using Reg D, right, which was a kind of signal that's much faster for energy storage assets. So energy storage, because it has a bidirectional inverter that has 4 quadrants of real and reactive power, which I'm not going to explain, but these inverters can do a lot other than converting DC to AC and AC to DC. Basically means that the contemporary energy storage systems that are delivering a lot of ROI around the world, not just in Germany and here and the UK, but around the world, can be a programmable appliance. Now, having said that, just to add in, you have to pick the right Ferrari engine or Volkswagen engine. You have to pick the right batteries to do that. But that's the basic 101 understanding of what energy storage systems can do. Now the JJ view, I would say in terms of what the grid needs, was expressed at about 20% by the last startup, Greensmith. But me and the team, we were just scratching the surface on what we can do, because people still want batteries, they want them to last long, they want to basically time shift the electricity, duck curve, and so on. So you have to, as a company, deliver things that people want to buy. Otherwise, you're not going to be successful commercially. I mean, it's insanely simple.
Yes.
But the number of startups that get that, and if you build it, they will come. And maybe you're at the bleeding edge a little too long, etc. But I think what the grid needs, especially at a time when you're transitioning to intermittent resources away from baseload like nuclear, like coal, like gas, is something that's more of what I believe is the problem with grid congestion. So I believe that grid congestion is an IT problem. It's not one of these hydrocarbons versus those hydrocarbons and just CO2 emissions and all these things that we care dearly about, and switching, and over half the investment around the world in generation assets is towards clean or renewable resources. And by the way, you can chop solar in half and assign it to one country, which is called China. And like Germany did, they're also reducing through the heads of the curve the cost per kilowatt of electricity that's generated through the photoelectric effect, which Bell Labs actually, I think, patented many days ago. But what I think this grid really needs, which speaks to the way it was built, which speaks to the underutilization of the grid, kind of like when Uber looked at transportation and said, hey, look, if we look at capacity differently and we look at all the cars that are parked in garages and we see the drivers, the utilization is probably under 20%, right? And then the rest is kind of history.
Yes.
Similar to that, if you look at a different grid that is utilized much more effectively and efficiently, and our electricity costs have continued to go up, you can do a lot more. And the thing about computing also is not just how effective it is at managing complex decisions at a nanosecond level, but that a single cycle of computing is approaching the cost of zero. So we've been so good that our iPhone 12s that are about to be shipped, 10 years ago, it would have cost probably $50,000. And we would have called it 20 years ago supercomputer. But we have it in our hands, and we're doing all sorts of things with it now, right? That we haven't done before. So very much like that. And we know how to do this because we've done it in other asset-intensive industries. What the grid needs is better decision-making across a more polynomial set of assets, including the transmission and distribution assets, not just the generation assets, where we're reading the press releases all the time. And secondly, we need to use what we know how to use, and that is data, better decisions, computing power, integrated networks, etc. A good story that I want to tell you about is that after the bolt-on acquisition exit with a great company called Wärtsilä, we used to hold, and I stayed there for post-merger integration about 18 months, and they won a couple of 100 megawatt awards this year, which is great during time of COVID.
Nice.
Good to see how much success, and that's more of a cultural shift. It's not just about having technology and having perhaps a company that delivered 100 systems across at the time I think 6 different countries and all that kind of stuff. And Wärtsilä has 150 different countries that they operate in, right? But what was interesting about this intellectual session that we had in Venice with the grid operators in Africa is I was going to do my spiel and talk about segment 1 and then segment 2 and
John's segment.
And everyone agreed that grid congestion is more a problem of managing the assets we have better, not just switching and retirement, and is it coal, is it batteries, is it yes, those issues are very important, and one actually can respond because of an inverter in as little as 10 milliseconds or less. But the biggest problem, everyone agreed in the room, and these are 20-year, 40-year grid operators in many nations in Africa where you have a national grid operator, right? In Western Europe and here, we've kind of disintegrated the market, just like like Texas and Australia, which is kind of similar. And then I said, show of hands, how many are electrical engineers? And of course, half the hands went up. How many are chemical? How many are mechanical? How many are civil? Nuclear. A lot of enthusiastic hands went up. And then I said, okay, how many are software engineers? Crickets. On this pristine island in Venice, where we were having this conference. And then I said, how many are data scientists or, so it's not to say they don't have those people in their organization, but the leaders.
Yeah.
And we're talking several leaders from each nation. I mean, to have that kind of change happen, this is why this vision of the first programmable grid appliance that grid operators have access to, that you can use fungibly across a myriad of different issues. And you can pick different batteries, like car engines and so on and so forth, where we won't even know energy storage is back there. Kind of like data centers. We don't know.
Yeah, we don't know which specific server or CPU is in that data center. As long as we know, we throw apps there and they run there. Yeah. And they charge us for it.
It reminds me of the debate we used to have back in the day of computing, because my other startups were mostly in computing and, electronic marketplaces that were taking, EDI to XML, extensible markup language, and all that kind of stuff, right? Is we used to talk about centralized and distributed computers. Remember that? You had, minis, you had, I mean, you can go back, UNIVAC. I mean, you can go back, right, central computing. And then you can think about the post-Microsoft era, IBM PC Junior and distributed computing, and everyone needed to have a license, and that was pretty good for the economic recurring revenue model and so on. But today we don't talk about it because the answer is yes. It's not one or the other. We need all these things to integrate and work with one another. Yeah. Right? Just like this video and how it's going to be propagated and people are going to enjoy it. They're going to download it. They're going to have it on a cloud, whatever, right? It's whatever. And not only that, the cost per bit has come down enormously, right? Yes. The electrical grid is almost exactly the same. And we know how to do this. So this vision of energy storage is that we noticed that across the many countries that we deployed energy storage, we were deploying it not only for ROI positive use cases on behalf of customers, because we were the agnostic provider of the technology, battery agnostic provider, where we didn't have a dog in the fight. We didn't push our batteries, we didn't push our inverters. We were like, okay, whatever makes the most amount of money for you, that's what we're gonna build for you because we have a battery agnostic platform. Yeah. Is that they understood how important software was to their use cases. Some of them literally put it in their contract because they wanted a license for the first time. They've never had a user license. Yes. And some of these companies that have been selling, big wind turbines, for instance. I mean, what happens is when the algorithms get changed, the wind turbines actually perform better. And, they charge an arm and a leg, but you can only get it from one vendor, the same vendor that sold you the wind turbine. Yes. Inverter, the PLC-based controllers, the same thing, right? But what I think the grid really needs, which is related to the second box, is, and I have a tremendous amount of passion of it, and it's computing power. It's making better decisions. Because whether you're in a so-called developed country, OECD country, like United States or Germany or United Kingdom, or you're in one of those places in Africa that are leapfrogging, like India is one of the biggest deployer of renewables right now, but they can also take advantage of software because it too is not super expensive. But the value that can be delivered by software on any of those generation assets, certainly energy storage, it's like less than 1% of the total cost when you spend $50 million on a very large energy storage system. But oh my God, does it deliver over 90% of the value? Because what it does is it not only allows that box to do all the things to make money, but regulators are changing rules. They're catching up, and they're not just saying, is energy storage a distribution asset or a generation asset? Depending upon the rule, we have this template that we use for wind and solar, or gas peaker, and when you want to use it for, these things are changing because, it's usually the human condition that's the last thing to change, right? Yeah. You want the software to be able to adjust, roll with the punches,
and optimize.
And also dynamically, if not just the day ahead market, but the 5-minute energy market in California spikes up to $2,000 per megawatt hour. Guess what? We're going to do that instead of providing, resource adequacy, which is what you get paid for in California. I mean, so there's many things that you can do. But if you start thinking about these less as batteries, less as inverters, kind of like the heliocentric and geocentric theories, right, of Copernicus, where we used to think that our planet, was the center of the universe, and we found out that later that the sun is, and then we found out that's actually not even the center. You know what I mean? There's different theories on what it means to be at the center and why it's important and all these things. But I think whether you look at cars, you look at houses, whether you look at the grid or a big ship or a big building, the center, in my view, should be a computer, because that's what's going to drive the performance, the efficiency, effectiveness of that asset. So I know I dragged on a little bit, but it's important to kind of explain all the aspects of that and why I also believe we're ready for this kind of transition.
And this is good because, one, it's an opportunity for startups, founders, to know that this is the right timing if you are, for example, considering building a new business in that area. And especially because it's more about software than anything else. And number two, I think it's also interesting, and maybe we can spend the last few minutes by talking about this. What's happening in the battery storage world that we should be aware of as individuals, not just as founders that want to start a startup in that space? What's the non-obvious, that maybe few non-obvious things that are true in the battery storage, and what's happening there, what you want people to be aware of?
Yeah, I could go on and on, but I'm going to relegate it to 3 important things that I think we should all be aware of, right? One is energy consumption and us paying our utility bills and pumping gas. It was almost an afterthought, because what are you going to do? Drive around town? I mean, some people do, but I would argue that you have a decrease in your return because you're wasting time and wasting gas, right?
Yes.
And then I can get into entropy on meat eating versus plant eating and all, like as a scientist, right? But I think we should all take ownership over our relationship and consumption of energy, not just for, greenhouse gases and carbon emissions, but just because once you start doing that, you start asking other questions. And that's when beautiful conversations, beautiful answers, beautiful startups like Tesla and other companies, become a real thing, Greensmith and so on. Yeah. So number one, I would do that. Number two, the thing that is making energy storage so intriguing to so many people around the world is because it's being more deployed. I mean, the growth is significant. You're going from hundreds of megawatts to hundreds of gigawatts very, very quickly, gigawatt hours, right? If you measure it in energy terms. But having said that, I would say it's driven by a law that we understand very well called the Henderson curve or learning curve, meaning as you produce more of a thing, as you double the production capacity of a thing, it goes down by a certain percentage, right? So approximately 85% learning curve or Henderson curve means when you double the production of a thing, 15% goes down in terms of unit cost, right? And we've seen it in other sectors very successfully. Computing was one that we talked quite a bit about. But solar modules, wind turbines, and batteries abide by approximately the same law, which is great. I mean, there were gigafactories. I've visited probably over 100 battery factories around the world. There were gigafactories before anything was announced in Reno, Nevada. And so it's a good time to be using batteries, let alone energy storage. But know that the cost reductions and improvements will not stop anytime soon. They will just keep going. So that's when you have absolute pervasiveness of a thing where you get to a point where you don't even think about energy storage being there because it's just so pervasive, and it's allowing our grid to be that time machine that we've never had. The final thing that I would say about energy storage is that it is not something, and we were an integrator, to be clear, meaning when we did about a third of the total energy storage in the United States in 2016 and 2017, we were acquired, and we said yes to the third offer. We did that with 30 people, approximately 30 people. And we did that turnkey. It wasn't just we, made a battery or we made one part of it, etc. We delivered the whole thing. In fact, we deployed the largest system in the world that year. I think Tesla and AES had a similar contract, and we commissioned ours. And Kaiso said, "Yep," earlier than they did, and we did that in under 4 months. So this house
as
here,
opposed to
as
couple
opposed
years,
to
maybe
4 years or 2 years for a typical power plant,
Yeah.
which energy storage system. This was a 100 megawatt hour system, which at the time was pretty big. Now it's an afterthought that it's 100 megawatt hours.
Yeah.
They're building gigawatt hour systems now, right? And you can also do that over a period of time. So these are very dispatchable technologies that not only can be Johnny on the spot when you have Aliso Canyon gas leak, which was one of the biggest, if not the biggest gas leak that we had in California, and we worry about capacity. And gas is still pretty important, right, as we transition. But that this system is run on software, and it's doing 4 different things to make money. It's being paid and justifying itself largely through resource adequacy, which is a product. And again, the 3 investor-owned utilities in California procure energy and some of its services, and they manage the distribution network. They're responsible. Along with Kaiso, they're responsible for the stability of the network. So resource adequacy is one use case application. Frequency regulation, which doesn't pay as well as some of the other wholesale markets, like PGM, which is the largest wholesale market in the world. It pays for that. Day-ahead energy market. This system is actually being bid in to day-ahead energy market, right? Where your grid operators are trying to balance their needs, versus supply. And then 5-minute energy market, which only some assets can play. If you think about how long a combined cycle gas peaker or a recip engine, they have different times that they start up and stop.
Yeah.
It's perfect for energy storage, right? In some moments, that system makes over $2,000 per megawatt hour because it's able to be dynamically bid. In this case, by humans, by a trading desk. They're like traders, energy traders. Yeah. But increasingly over time through AI and machine learning, that'll anticipate based on other conditions. So
and inform production maybe. Alongside
can provide information where you really have an integrated grid. To me, an integrated grid, just like integrated data centers, which will quickly consume over 20% of the electricity on the planet. And watching the Amazons, the Apples, the Googles, etc., transition and take hold of their own renewable energy and also the reliability of that energy is really going to move the needle. I think that's one of the key catalysts behind the change. That's going to mean a lot of changes to a lot of different things that we've built over the last 100 years. But what it also means that to the extent that these regulators change what they pay for certain activities or even more services that you need as Hawaii and California goes 100% by the year, 2045? I think that's the RPS mandate, right?
It's going to happen earlier than that, in my view.
I would agree with you. And there's nothing wrong with getting to 80% first.
Yes.
I think we sometimes talk about 100 a little too much. Getting to 80 is going to be a lot faster than the last 20%, in my
and it's going to matter more because it's 4/5 of your pollution and everything else.
Exactly. And why get hung up on why let perfect be the enemy of good?
Absolutely.
Right? As we like to say when we build startup companies. So that's the third thing that people should really understand, that it's here to stay. This is not a flight of fancy. It's not like blockchain, which we'll talk about at another time, which has its ups and downs related to the Byzantine generals problem. It's really one that abides by the Henderson curve. The people that are making hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of investment, either in equity or debt into things like renewables, but also energy storage, they don't care. They care about return on investment because that's what they're hired to care, right?
But thankfully, that is now becoming more and more aligned with the environment.
It is.
And good things for humanity, which is good.
I would argue that is icing on the cake, where you have trillions of dollars being invested in the energy transition. And ESG funds, BlackRock and some of the biggest funds in the world are saying we're not going to invest. But let me put it this way: if the parity levelized cost of energy was not hitting the level that it did for wind a while ago and now solar, do you think those companies would be? Basically, this is a decree that defines what kind of investment that they're looking at.
Yeah.
Do you think they would have been so eager to make such an adamant statement about what they will and will not invest in? Probably not.
Yeah.
So we need that, right? And that's good because, you know, a lot of these investments get determined, and what technologies get deployed get determined on financial return. And
Yes.
you know, to this day, we don't know a better system for gauging the efficiency, effectiveness of something than financial return. Now, the good news is it's also good for the planet. It's good
Yeah.
for our kids. It's good for our grandkids, and so on. And I tend to be very optimistic, as you know, about not so much whether we're going to hit 1.5 degrees centigrade or 2 degrees, depending upon which accord you subscribe to, but our ability as a race, as a species, to innovate our way out of problems. You know, sometimes our best thinking and our best capabilities are done when we're under duress, and it brings people together, just like teams that you see.
Yeah.
When a small startup wants to go up against ABB, Siemens, and GE combined,
Yeah.
and delivers more energy storage capacity in the United States than them, you know, you need a lot of belief, right?
Yes.
Even if you have a good strategy. And so I think we need to come together. We need to recognize that typically human condition is the last thing to change, and technology is ready, and the cost curve is also ready. This is one of those times, and I would urge all the listeners to not only think about those three things and many other things, including the relationship of their lives and the way they consume energy, and you know, range anxiety and all these kind of things,
Yes.
to this golden renaissance period that we're in, where I think Department of Commerce estimated that our inflation rate, this is a little bit old, so it could be a little bit different, but that our inflation rate as a country would be 2% higher if it was not for IT. And that's one of the reasons why we don't have the kind of amazing job growth that continues with our GDP growth and, you know, wealth accumulation, and you know, it creates income disparity and all that kind of stuff, which is another
a bigger topic.
conversation, which we hadn't seen since the 1930s, I think, the last time I checked. But anyway, we have all the technology, we have all the feasibility in economics, and we just need to do it. And we need to support distributed energy resources. We need to let what's happening, and there's a lot of regulation that's changing. I mean, we're trying to usher in where some of those tax credits, not only which are stepped down, by the way, for both wind and solar, but also can apply to energy storage in isolation. It doesn't have to ride the coattails of solar, which is how it's grandfathered and so on. So there's a lot of things that are changing, but it's really about the human change that is necessary for us to take advantage of these technologies. So,
Nice.
So it's a good time to be alive and be involved in the energy space.
Beautiful. Thanks a lot for your time, and I hope you enjoyed our conversation. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.